I think lying in bed listening to transistor radio, very quietly in my room, and trying not to disturb my parents. I got introduced really to sort of what would be now known as classic rock music by my older brothers and sisters. My brother had a great stereo, and he had Aerosmith records and Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and I would put them on and listen to them, and be like kind of scared but kind of excited too at the same time. And then when I'd go back to my room, all I would have is my little transistor radio. So I would record, like we used to do cassettes off of the speaker, trying to make sure you got it in after the DJ and before the DJ started talking, that sort of early thing. And it was all kinds of music. I mean, it was pop music from the Carpenters, or backed with into Procol Harum, into all kinds of these different things that you'd never know, or even the Terry Jacks and Susan Jacks and stuff like that. Just listening to pop music on the radio, and it was always really an important part of my life, and my time spent in my room.
How grateful are you now, looking back, that your brother had such great taste in music?
Oh, my brother and my sister, they both. My sister, they were members of the Columbia Music Club, remember? Where they would
you'd order 10 albums and 9 of them would show up incorrect. And
basically, yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, they showed me the way for music, for sure.
And did you play any instruments at all as a kid? And if so, how did you gravitate towards those instruments?
Well, my dad went down to the local auction in Dundas and picked up an old Gerhard Heinzmann piano. It was an upright, and still to this day, I know it was kind of pokey, but it didn't have that. It had a great sound to it. Actually, it wasn't that kind of. Back in that era, there were those low half harp pianos that you would get from Simpson Sears or something like that, and they always had that sort of plunky kind of sound to them. This had like a real kind of barroom upright piano sound, because it was always kind of out of tune, and not exactly tack piano, but anyway, he got that piano, and I asked to get lessons. They didn't say, you have to take piano lessons. The piano was just there, and I said, look, my friend across the street was getting piano lessons. It's like, can I get piano lessons too? So I just took a couple of years, and then my brother introduced me to, he was a guitar player. So he said, he introduced me to guitar, and learned how to play guitar when I was about 11 or 12, and sort of, none of which I ever really became virtuoso on. Unfortunately, I would have loved to have been a great musician, but I don't believe that I have there's a certain intangible quality to musicians who are really great improvisers or good interpreters or whichever. I don't have that skill, unfortunately, and I kind of realized that fairly early on, that I would never be an amazing musician, but I always wanted to do something in music anyway. Luckily, I found a niche where I could use my love of music and my kind of understanding of it without having to rely on my very bad chops, of which there are very little.
Well, speaking of bad chops, did you end up playing in any bands? Were there some horrible band names?
I never really was in bands per se. We were in garage rehearsal band people.
You never made it to the stage?
Never made it really to, well, a couple of little things, but nothing of any consequence. No. I would have loved to. I loved playing with music, but it's funny. My friend group at the time, none of them, they were into music. None of them were into playing anything. And none of them, I was the only one who actually played an instrument at all. And so nobody was really interested in being in a band. They were interested in going to parties where bands were playing, but not being the entertainment.
So you're telling me that there will never be videos on YouTube that surface of you playing in a young band?
No, not in a young band. Later on in life, I did a gig with Peter Gabriel a couple of years ago at a conference here in Toronto, playing bass actually on that one, but nothing of substance. No.
That's funny. Not a lot of musicians would go from practicing in the garage and then when they make the stages with Peter Gabriel. So that's
well, I ended up learning like instruments as studio, stuff. So I learned to be able to play stuff in studio. And if I rehearse enough, I can hack it out, but I'm by no means any kind of special musician. I'm functional at best, I'd say.
Before you start to get serious about wanting to become a recording engineer, was there anything that you wanted to be as a kid when you grew up?
No, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I went to community college for a while in a just general business program. That really didn't appeal to me that much. And so I was kind of, as a kid, uh, lost from a career standpoint. I didn't really know where I wanted to go. And it was the moment that I walked into the first recording studio I ever went into that I knew.
And if iPods existed back when we were kids, when we were 16, what would we find on your iPod?
Oh, well, I had Walkmans, so they were around. Yeah, I mean, I listened to all kinds of things. In my early life was, again, things like Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, progressive things like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and then in the '80s got more into uh, the Fix, or got into actually really a lot ska music, the Specials, the Selector, the Beat in Canada known as the English Beat. Things like that. They were exciting music. I was never a huge fan of the Pistols, particularly, but I loved what they did to kind of up, the upheaval. The Clash, of course, were great. The Jam, things like that. That would have been sort of the development. But honestly, early on, my very first single 45 that I ever bought was the Carpenters' "On Top of the World."
That's amazing. So we're about to dive super deep into recording engineering. Before we do so, what were some of the jobs you had before becoming a recording engineer? And is there one horrible job that stands out as the worst amongst all of those?
Well, I think I did a lot of things. I worked at a gas station in high school for years, pumping gas as a part-time job. That was great. The hours were perfect for after school. The people that I worked with, the mechanics and the boss, they were great people. So I liked that job. Two that were real clunkers for me. Well, I mean, we would do sort of part-time work at the steel mill in Hamilton, Stelco. We would clean underneath rod mills and do sort of just like picking up spare change on the weekend, that kind of thing. But my worst two, one of which was working for a moving company. I really, really hated that. They tended to overwork the young guys like I was at the time. So there was very little sleep and lots of heavy lifting. And I'm not a big person. So I credit it for me learning how to lift things properly. So it actually helped for later on in life when I was touring. So lifting flight cases, you learn to do that easily and pack. Actually, I can pack a truck pretty well. So that sort of thing. But I think probably my worst one was I was 2 nights of a overnight security guard in a truck parking lot, basically like a truck yard. And the first night I did, the guy pointed out that when I was going around to check the back of the trucks, I should grab a big piece of lumber just in case there was somebody back there. And the second night, I spent the entire night in the office and did not leave and never went back. So I was the worst night security you could ever hope for.
Did that produce any nightmares of what could happen if you stayed on that job?
No, because I didn't stay on that job. I knew right away. It's like, yeah, I'm not doing this. This is not my calling.
When we're young, we're often told to go to school, get a normal job. Was there any fear for you that you wouldn't be able to make a living in the entertainment industry as a producer?
No, not really. I mean, I had great support. So when I was just beginning college, when I was 19, my father died. And so it clouded my perspective for a number of years. So I carried on through my college program, again, not knowing what I was going to do, but my mother was saying, look, just finish college, try to, get something to fall back on. So I was, okay, I did. And then sadly, a great friend of mine at the end of college that I had made during my time at college, really interesting character who I really looked up to, ended up having a psychological breakdown and killed himself at the end of the third year. And that kind of, in a strange way, sort of woke me back up to be like, look, you're on a path that you're not going to be very happy with for the rest of your life. So you better find something. And even at that time, my family all said, look, you're going to spend a lot of time in the job that you're doing in life. You better enjoy it at least somewhat. So I started looking around of what things I could do. And my girlfriend at the time said, look, my uncle has a recording studio. She knew I wanted to do something with music. She said, it's got a recording studio down in Hamilton. Why don't you go talk to him, see what he has to say? So I went down and ended up doing an internship there. And during that time, there was, it was an unpaid internship, like they are very common now. They weren't quite so common back then, but I cut grass in the daytime, washed windows, cleaned houses, did anything I could to make a few bucks, and went down to the studio at night.
So I reached out to our mutual friend Alf to help me start off this podcast right, and I forgot to read the quote right off the top. So here are some kind words from Alf Annabellini. This is what he says about David Bottrill. Aside from nonstop amazing productions, which is obvious, his ongoing work with Make Music Matter may actually be the thing I find most admirable. It's not lip service. He puts himself out there and they change lives. Oh, and he's a great guy to hang with. So that's from Alf, just to set the tone for.
Oh, that's very kind of Alf.
So we're going to dive into the recording engineering now. Where did this love of audio come from? So you mentioned your family was always playing music, and you become a music fan, you get interested in instruments, but where specifically audio? I mean, most music fans don't turn to become an audio engineer creating audio.
Well, when I was a little kid, my parents were looking for things that would interest me, and they bought me one of those transistor radio kits with the great big soldering gun when it was a big gun, and I put that together. Never worked properly. But I had another radio that was working, and in the area that I was growing up in was a sort of new development. There were all kinds of new like telephone cables being put in, and there were a couple of these rolls of them that were just left by the phone company in one of the properties, and it had all these wires in it. So I got these wires and I took them home and managed to get, I don't even know where I got them, but all these tiny little drivers, and I thought, this is great. And I put them all around my room and I attached them up with this telephone wire that came all coming from my transistor radio. So I made myself a very mono, but surround sound little mini driver thing all around my room. And it was so much fun to listen to music in there. It was all in mono. I'm sure the phase relationship was terrible and everything, but it was a blast for me when I was a kid. So I don't know if that led me onto a path of engineering, because it was the worst possible signal path ever, and huge load on the whole thing. Anyway, it was a lot of fun to do. And then when I found myself going into recording studios and knowing that I really wasn't the greatest musician, I thought, well, look, you want something to do with music. Here's an area where you have some sort of mild aptitude or potentially an aptitude towards. And you can learn from these people, these engineers that are doing things. You can learn how to run a console. You can learn what microphones are doing. And that's a way you can have something to do with the music industry without failing because of your lack of actual musical playing ability.
And do you remember your first time being in a recording studio where you were actually working, whether it was as an assistant or an engineer? Can you remember the first time?
I think
I was going to say getting paid, but you don't always get paid as the runner or the.
I think one of my earlier sessions actually was with the band Shadowy Men on a Shadowy Planet. I was working at Grand Avenue Studios in Hamilton, and they came in. This was, I think, their first or second recording that they'd done, and it was being produced by a guy called Coyote Shivers. And
good name.
Yeah. He's in Los Angeles now. Anyway, he brought in this session of these guys, and it was all instrumental. And we set them up and started recording, and it was really exciting because the band was kicking ass, and it was primarily instrumental. Kind of that sort of vibe. Anyway, it was a great time. So it was a great sort of first session where I was able to sort of learn as I was going along, but still get something kind of exciting at the same time.
And how early on did you realize that you had a skill, that you had something of value to offer that people could use, people would demand their, and that this was something that you actually wanted to do as a career?
I think it generally came from the musicians that I had worked with. They'd be uh, really grateful for the work that I had done, and excited by the sound of what we came up with in the studio. I remember there was this saxophone player called, I think, Ron Anderson, I think was his name. That could be wrong about that. And it was very early on in my career. He was sort of in that sort of jazz group era in Toronto in the very early '80s. Great player, kind of at one point a very avant-garde style of sax playing. Anyway, we were working in the studio. I was recording him and on something. And anyway, he said something that was really nice. He said that what I had done to his sax to give him something to play around with from a treatment or an engineering standpoint, he said it was really sort of innovative, and that, I told him that I had some other opportunities to go to, and he said, well, if you ever leave Canada, they'll be missing a great engineer. And so I thought that was a really nice thing to say, and it made me think, maybe I'm not too bad at this.